Hello, Asia, and hello, world. Corruption and excesses of elected government officials are once again at the center of attention in several countries in Asia as public outrage continues to grow. In Indonesia, mass protest actions erupted in late August 2025 against economic and political frustration and reports of parliamentarians receiving monthly housing allowances equivalent to 10 times the minimum wage in the capital, Jakarta. The protesters called for a salary cut for the parliamentarians, among others. This later led to the government announcing that they would cut the housing allowance and suspend overseas trips of members of parliament. In the Philippines, meanwhile, netizens have been calling out and shaming contractors and children of the incorporators of those construction companies with flood control projects who have been displaying their lavish lifestyle online. Not to mention, several of these flood control projects were found to be bogus. These contractors were also found to have direct and indirect familial and political ties with elected government officials. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., in his latest State of the Nation address, called out alleged ghost flood control projects and vowed to file charges against those who are involved in corruption in these projects. Amid the public outrage, the president has ordered a lifestyle check on all government officials and said that he will issue an executive order forming an independent commission that will look into anomalies of flood control projects. Quite recently, in Nepal, violent protests erupted where at least 19 people were killed when government forces opened fire on protesters. The protest actions, which expressed outrage against the so-called Nepo kids of the country's political elite flaunting their lavish lifestyle, were triggered by a social media ban but was said to have been fueled by years of resentment against those in power. The protesters have set fire at Parliament and the Supreme Court as well as the homes of lawmakers and government officials. The government has lifted its ban on social media platforms while Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli has resigned. In recent years, similar public outrage in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh led to shifts in political dynamics toppling regimes. The Sri Lanka Aragalaya protest movement in 2022 forced out then-President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was accused of running the island nation's economy into the ground through corruption and mismanagement. The 2024 protests in Bangladesh, which raised demands to abolish quotas in civil service jobs, were compounded by the worsening economic conditions and allegations of rampant corruption. Then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was forced to resign and fled the country. In this episode of the Election Observer podcast, we'll discuss the power of the electorate beyond the ballot box to demand accountability against erring elected public officials and drive change through collective action. I'm your host, John Antiquera, and we are live via ANFREL's Facebook and LinkedIn pages, as well as via ANFREL's YouTube channel. Why is that high? The episodes of the Election Observer podcast can also be streamed later on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Joining us in this episode are Sankhitha Gunaratne, the Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption and Deputy Director at Verité Research, and Primayogha, Advocacy Coordinator at Indonesia Corruption Watch. Hello, Sankhitha and Egi. Welcome to the Election Observer podcast.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes. As we have seen, no, as we have observed lately, people are angry, and rightfully so. No, we're seeing initial responses to the public outrage against alleged corruption and excesses of public officials as a way to appease the public. But often than not, there is no follow through, and that there are very few, if at all any, held accountable. My first question is, how do we ensure that there are proper and thorough actions against these alleged corrupt practices and accountability on the part of erring public officials? Anyone can go first. Yes, Egi.
Oh, okay. So thank you. We see it's been happening in Indonesia, and I would like to say that to me, everything doesn't start in August. Like rather, it's it's an accumulation of anger, frustration, the feeling of getting injustice. People are having difficulties in their life because of the tax rates, like staple food prices. Like meanwhile, the public officials are living in luxury, and corruption is rampant everywhere. So people eventually decide to go to the street protesting about everything, and the tension is increasing because of the killing of the motorcycle taxi driver by the authorities, and there hasn't been any justice to it. And yes, what's been happening in Indonesia relates to the election, but I will rather say it's not only about the last election, but like for previous election, we failed to elect good and proper leaders, both in executive and legislative powers. But of course, I believe that people don't deserve to be blamed for everything, because if we look at the for previous election, we the citizens, voters, always be over limited options. What I meant by that is there were no candidates like free from dirty elites interest, or had enough commitment to anti-corruption. So eventually, leads to the current situation. And it's the answer to the question is not that simple, but at the very least, in the Indonesian context, we need to promote political party reform so they can offer us better candidates. And at the same time, we can do, research about the candidates, their background affiliation, whether they have negative backgrounds, or, for example, their involvement in corruption cases, or, affiliated to those who were involved in corruption. And we can also do campaigns about that to make public more aware about it. And I think with that effort, we can minimize the negative outcomes of the dirty election, and we as a citizen don't get blamed for it.
How about you, Sankhitha, in the case of Sri Lanka? The Sri Lanka has the protest happened in many years ago, and you've had an election already last year in 2024, I believe. Yes, it was
Yeah.
just last year, no? So you've gone through that process of um, the people protesting against the government in Sri Lanka. Were able to have him resign. Now you've elected a new government. How do you keep the ball rolling in terms of holding those who were allegedly corrupt accountable?
Yeah. Start with the first question and then I guess go on to the next. I think what's important is to ensure that the candidates are vetted properly through voter awareness. And voter awareness is not an easy thing to do. It has to build up over time, right? It's not something that can be done by civil society or journalists in the short time when you know an election is happening. It has to be a continuous process. So some of the tools that we've used in Sri Lanka is one is on asset declarations of candidates and elected public officials and senior public officials, not the political elite, but the public officials themselves, right? So we have for years run a campaign that has looked for transparency, pushed for transparency of asset declarations, and we've now just in 2023 managed to get that through the legislative process. And now we are at a juncture where we're trying to action it and ensure that meaningful information is made available to the public so that they can make a decision as to whether politicians who are at least running for a second or third time have in their past tenure illicitly enriched themselves. And the Sri Lankan Asset Declaration, and it's an interesting lesson, right? Even the former form from 1975 had two sections to it, a part A and a part B. And the first section has the assets and liabilities of a public official or politician in the first year when they took public office. And the second section has the current year. So just on seeing that form, if you could get access to it, you could do a quick comparison of whether there has been a common sense comparison of whether there has been illicit enrichment that is not commensurate to their legitimate known sources of wealth. So that I think still remains. I know it's a pretty mainstream tool, but given that we've had to fight so hard for public access across the world, I think it's something that's really worth keeping on pushing for. And another little example I'd like to give, that Verité Research, the organization I currently work with, runs, there's a platform called monthly.lk, which is effectively a parliamentary monitoring website that looks at the Hansards, the official record of parliament, to see how much MPs have contributed in parliamentary debates and at committees, etc., to see their voting records and what subjects that they have talked about. And this information is made publicly available so that citizens, so we act as a bridge for basically decoding parliament for the public and ensuring that people know who has been active, what has been their voting record on key public issues like constitutional amendments. Have they, changed their position just along party lines and not on principle? So these, over time, tend to get traction with the people. So these are really important aspects. Now, to your question, to your second question, how do we really keep people accountable in the wake of this kind of democratic outrage or uprising? This is a harder question, because how do you ensure that accountability is not merely performative but real, right? And this is especially important in the context of coming out of context of state capture, right? So state capture is, casually, if you put the idea of state capture, it is when the institutions of government, like the executive, the legislature, sometimes the judiciary, public institutions, are being used and weaponized in the interest of a few rather than in the public interest, right? So are bills being passed in parliament, are laws being passed that are for private interest rather than public interest, are tax concessions being given to certain projects to just facilitate corruption by legitimizing it through law, right? So you're using law as a tool of oppression and private benefit rather than of public interest. So that is a particularly concerning level of corruption, and I would say that is what this outrage is building up against. So in that kind of context, you have uprisings, protests, like the Sri Lanka's Aragala and what's unfolding in Nepal right now. So in this kind of moment, you have accountability, quote unquote, accountability, ideally unfolding, but there's also almost a frenzy that happens around it, right? And that can be legitimate, it can be democratic, but it can also very easily cross the line into what is illegal, what is overreach. So even within democratic institutions, in that power vacuum that happens, you don't want institutions that are supposed to act independently, like the judiciary or anti-corruption agencies, overreaching. You don't want legislatures building in law that is, again, that still can facilitate overreach. So it has to be a very careful line that is trodden, that is a path that is walked at this point of time. So while it is a window of opportunity, I think the watchdog function of civil society, of citizens, of voters, of journalists still remains extremely important, because we shouldn't also get caught up in the frenzy of the moment. And the markers of that can be whether is it just a spate of arrests, or do they translate into actual indictments in court? Do they translate into convictions? Are there arrests of people even in power subsequently? Because if we are being impartial, then it shouldn't just be a political witch hunt against those who just lost power, but against those who are sitting in office right now as well. Do they have clear case selection criteria, right? Or are they going to, pursue people just for, you know, drama or, you know, attention at those points in time. So having that measured approach is really, really important. And civil society, journalists, citizens have a difficult line to walk in that kind of moment. I'll
Yes.
stop because I've talked a lot, but yeah.
No, no. I think I can relate to this somehow because with what's happening, I'm from the Philippines. With what's happening in my own country, there are now ongoing hearings, investigations done by our Congress, both Senate and the House of Representatives, are investigating alleged corruption in flood control projects. But then the question is, um, does this investigation do these investigations actually translate into actual cases against these alleged contractors who allegedly have bogus projects, no? But just to follow up on what you've said, and this is a question for the both of you, because you've mentioned about um, disclosure of the assets and liabilities of your public officials. I know in Sri Lanka you have an RTI. I'm not particularly sure about Indonesia, and also if you have a similar tool for your government officials for them to disclose their statements, their assets and liabilities. No, but in terms of being able to use this as a tool against uh, possibly corruption, no, and disclosure of how these government officials have acquired wealth when they're in office, or hopefully they don't know if they're straight and they're not corrupt. But how do you think disclosure, access to information, and disclosure of assets and liabilities of government officials can help deter corruption in government?
Is it me first? Okay.
Yes, please go ahead,
Okay.
Eddie.
Yeah. What's been happening in Indonesia like recently? It's also triggered by the lavish lifestyle and extreme wealth of the politicians, and
Yes.
without they already are showing it off to the public, and this better then lead us to the question like how are they able to live in such luxury, how do they get
Yes.
the money, and this is the point where that asset declaration and corruption became relevant because we
Mm-hmm.
suspect that they are able to live with luxury because of illicit money. So
Yes.
I believe that we need some you know actions to stop their behavior. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, I would say it may begin with first promoting public ethics, the principle
Mm-hmm.
that even without any law about it, we need
Yes.
to hold to that principle. And, is it appropriate for me to do this since I'm a public servant? And the second one, of course, the asset declaration laws itself, we have it. So, like we have that laws which requires the public official to declare their assets at least once a year.
Mm-hmm.
Like their wealth, the asset, the money, and everything, and they need to do that
Yes.
regular by in regular by once a year. But the thing is, the laws only make them they only need to report that, but the law enforcement agency, they sometimes they don't really check about their honesty in
Oh.
their in declaring their asset and wealth. That's also the problem in the asset declaration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the important thing. And we also need the illicit enrichment laws,
Mm-hmm.
which Indonesia don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have that law, the law enforcement will be easier to prosecute someone who has suspicious wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Even for example, if they don't declare the asset, so the law enforcement agency can investigate it further.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the last thing is I also agree about the independent oversight bodies because it's
Mm-hmm.
happening here in Indonesia. We don't
Mm-hmm.
really have, like accountability institution, which is, free from certain interests. They
Mhm.
have, like, for example, like the Corruption Eradication Commission is now under the executive power, and we expect that it's supposed to be independent. So yeah, I think that some of things that I mentioned is are important to make, that corruption is to be going in our country.
Mhm.
I think on our end, we can serve as a story for the good and the bad. So
Mhm.
in Sri Lanka, we've had an asset declaration law since 1975,
Mhm.
and public access was technically possible for anyone who requested it since 1988. But then, if I accessed it, I couldn't disclose it to anyone else. So for years, civil society ran a campaign asking MPs to disclose their asset declarations publicly
I
themselves,
see.
because that
Mhm.
wasn't an offense. So that was a campaign that was partially successful. There were MPs a cross-party group of MPs that came forward and made the asset declarations public. But parallel to that, civil society pushed for amendments to these laws to get rid of the
Mhm.
obsolete provisions about criminalizing publication. And
Mhm.
now we're at a point where we have a really good law. So we've solved a lot of the problems of the past, where asset declarations used to be given under confidential cover to different agencies, and they used to just sit in cupboards in different offices, decentralized, until someone made a complaint against a public official. So that wasn't an effective system. But now we have a system where asset declarations are supposed to be submitted online, which will come into effect next year. And they're
Mhm.
supposed to be submitted online to the anti-corruption agency, which has been given legal independence from the executive, all intents and purposes. And then, I mean, no institution is completely safe, but independence exists. So it's all supposed to be submitted to the anti-corruption agency or the ECA, and
Mhm.
then the law also provides for verification for the system to actually have red flags generated based on the information provided, and for the
Mhm.
system to actually have access to other databases within the state, say on procurement or inland revenue or customs, or
Mhm.
possibly even political finance declarations. So we are now at a point where we have a law that provides for all of that. So the
Mhm.
question is, how does it get action? Right? So
Yes.
when you ask what is the impact of asset declarations on anti-corruption investigations, we are yet to see come to full kind of fruition, but
Mhm.
there is a lot of potential. But already, based on the fact that we had an asset disclosure system in place, those were useful systems to actually form the basis of an investigation. Say,
Mhm.
during the Pandora Papers expose, for example, there were Sri Lankan
Yes.
politicians that were, um, you know, highlighted in the exposes. Of course, it's not a finding, but there were assets that were traced and exposed as existing. So now,
Mhm.
if we were to use the asset declaration to compare whether that information was disclosed or not, those assets
Mhm.
that were found abroad, whether they were disclosed or not, already they would give us a good basis to figure out whether there is a suspicion of illicit enrichment.
Mhm.
So the system itself, if it works optimally or even suboptimally, having asset disclosures has always proved to be a really useful indicator of intent to hide an asset, which would
Yes.
be pointed towards illicit enrichment. But of course, it depends on vigilant citizens, investigative journalists doing their jobs really, really well. So it's always a fight against the odds.
Mm, I see. Um, Corruption in government is nothing new. No, it can be considered as something of a tale as old as time. No, yet it continues to happen. It's as if we never learn from it. It's as if people who do corrupt things never learn from it. So even like the term of nepo babies and nepo kids, it's a new term, but then the flaunting of their lavish lifestyle is nothing new. People do it and they're quite proud of it. I don't know. But at this point, it's impossible, I think, also to assume that there are no anti-corruption measures in place. There should be. I hope there are. And I know there should be anti-corruption measures, no? But things happen again and again. So my question is like, partly you've answered this, no? But like, what else can we do to fortify anti-corruption measures to prevent public officials and those that have ties with them from corrupting, from leeching off the public offers?
Yeah, like in Indonesian context, the corruption has become normalized. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's been there since maybe 100 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
even if we look at the 1998, we have that kind of reformation. You know, like we established independent anti-corruption commission. We call it
Mm-hmm.
KPK, and they actually succeed to prosecute like huge actors who did corrupt practices. But
Mm-hmm.
sadly in 2019, like the KPK was weakened by the revision, and like corruption eradication efforts currently going backward in Indonesia. It's
Mm-hmm.
became normalized again, like the collusion, nepotism, and corruption itself. It just became normal, because if we also look at you know, the previous election, not the national election, local election, there are so many, candidates affiliated to the political dynasties. So it shows that that nepotism has become normalized in Indonesia,
Mm-hmm.
because like political dynasty itself is a form of nepotism. But
Mm-hmm.
to me, to combat corruption, like there is no single solution to
Yes.
do a lot of effort to combat that. Like we
Mm-hmm.
can begin, for example, to establish again independent anti-corruption commission, and
Mm-hmm.
the other things that we can do, for example, like raising awareness to the public, so public can be easily angry if they see someone do the corrupt practices, or we can
Mm-hmm.
provide them like the citizen with monitoring portal, like digitally, or train them to how to monitor corruption. There are a lot of
Yes.
things to do. Even political party has
Mm-hmm.
been has been a problem in Indonesia for a while, because
Mm-hmm.
they fail to produce like good politicians,
Mm-hmm.
politician who has integrity, who has good competency in managing the country.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think the political party reform is also important for combating corruption, because they really have vital roles in running the country.
Yes. Before I go to Sankhitha, I just wanted to add also, I agree with providing information to the public, because, like for example, in corruption, when it comes to procurement of projects, procurement in the procurement process, no, if people are not aware of the process itself, they wouldn't be able to know and trace where corruption might happen. So it's important, of course, as well, that we are aware of processes in government where possible corruption can happen. And I agree with that. Information, providing information and tools to the public for them to be able to monitor for themselves as well. Aside from the work of civil society organizations and journalists, to be able to monitor really what's happening, to request information from their governments, to request contracts, to be able to scrutinize these things. It's important, no? Information, yes. How about you, Sankita?
Yeah, so in terms of responding and kind of protecting against corruption, I want to make four key points, four key ways in which we can do this based on our experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is about obviously legal reform. None of this is magic or
Yes.
new. Legal reform, systemic reform,
Mm-hmm.
and then awareness. And I also want to talk about litigation. So these are the four
Mm-hmm.
things. So
Yes.
legal reform, system reform, awareness, and strategic litigation. So on the legal reform, and this connects to something you were just saying, it's really important to have the kind of legal reform that can resist temporary changes. So in Sri Lanka, the Right to Information Act that was passed in 2016, and after a almost 30-year campaign to have a right to information law in Sri Lanka, that has been a real big game changer and an antidote to corruption, both in a deterrent sense and second, in addressing instances of corruption after the fact. A second key legal reform, like a spate of legal reform, actually came in response to the economic crisis that happened in Sri Lanka and the Aragale, because we had the IMF entering the room to bail Sri Lanka out of our economic crisis with an extended fund facility. And when the IMF did a governance diagnostic assessment for Sri Lanka, they actually put in certain priority recommendations, and this actually included some key legal reform on anti-corruption. So I always say it's like a dream come true for any anti-corruption activists to suddenly have reform on the Anti-Corruption Act, the procurement law, on beneficial ownership, on asset declarations, on proceeds of crime, all coming in at the same time, right? Now, whether the IMF dictated the agenda or whether they took in civil society feedback enough is a whole other conversation, because civil society ran a process that it made sure in Sri Lanka that its voices were heard. And at the end of the day, we ended up with an 80-90% overlap between what civil society was proposing and what the IMF actually agreed with the government for the government to do. But in this kind of instance, when you have an entire plethora of dream laws coming into effect, it still was really important to ensure that you inform the reform, right? Make sure that the reform is contextual, that it carries the richness of all of the experiences that the country has gone through in the run-up to this, because these are not happening in a vacuum. These are also prioritized because there's been a movement for these changes over time. It's not, cut and paste some agenda, right?
Yes.
So the fact that all of that work had been done over time on these laws really helped make sure that we capitalize on this window of opportunity. And then, so informing the reform on all of these things, because if you don't remain vigilant on the legal reform, it can really just go through anyway.
Yeah.
The laws can go through anyway, and I can attest to the fact that we had to fight many battles at all stages of the legislative process, before court, in parliament, because there were no consultation at different stages for each and every one of these laws, right? So legal reform that is long-lasting, that is resilient, that is informed by local experience, context, and international expertise and best practice is one of the key things. The second one is about systemic reform, right? So once we have the laws in place, whether you have it or not, making sure information is proactively disclosed on a regular basis, so that we can keep track of what's going on. Like, the information is available for us to do with it what we will, right? And the second one is what you referred to about procurement, making sure, say, the procurement information is made publicly available. We know the Open Contracting Partnership has put together a list of red flags in public procurement, corruption red flags in public procurement. For us to be able to actually generate these red flags, we need a certain level of information being made publicly accessible. That being made available only to the authority is not enough, because, as I said, we're talking about context of state capture, right? Where the authorities may not be acting in the public interest, and civil society journalists, citizens, activist group have to take on that burden of monitoring. So making sure system reform is done so that information disclosure is the norm becomes a really, really important thing. And then digital innovation and using the advent of digitization and AI and things like that to make sure information is automated, made available in accessible format, in a timely way, is also really important in terms of system reform. The third one, of course, is keeping citizens informed, alert, interested, aware is a huge part of the deal, because I remember, and I don't say this in any kind of boastful way, but I remember feeling like we were speaking out into a vacuum about asset declarations, about asset recovery, and feeling like, what's the point, right? We keep talking, we keep saying the same things, no one's listening. But during the Aragan era, what we found out was that it had all somehow gained purchase somewhere, and people were suddenly echoing back to us what we had been saying for years. So I just want to say, if there's anyone watching that also feels that way, it comes back in the most astounding and surprising ways that people have actually been maybe listening on a surface level at least and just kind of heard the language we've been saying. But in moments of democratic reform, those tend to get traction. So it's important to keep that information alive and active in the minds of the people, even when it feels like there's no point to it, always talking, saying the same thing. And the other one I wanted, the fourth thing was the importance of strategic litigation. So we saw during the Aragade, when the president was still in power, when the prime minister was still in power, civil society in Sri Lanka filed the economic crisis case in the Supreme Court. And it was an exercise in using all avenues that were available to us. So this was a forum, the Supreme Court was a forum that could be agitated with evidence of misdeeds, of mishandling of the economy. And then the Supreme Court actually made a finding that there were people responsible, public officials responsible, politicians responsible, central bank governors responsible for what happened to the economy. So that's a powerful tool. So I mean, I am talking about strategic litigation for the economic crisis, for procurement fraud that took place in terms of health-related health sector medical supplies that were, leading to deaths of patients who were being administered low quality drugs that were basically 100% profit for people who brought these things because they were corrupt deals, and capitalizing on the economic crisis to, again, for the rich and corrupt to benefit. So strategic litigation helped in that kind of moment as well. And it continues to do so in terms of environmental disasters, things like that. So that also is a way of ensuring that there is a recent response to certain cases that are offensive to the public, because the courts have to give a considered judgment rather than a political response. And actually forcing, in a way, the courts to reckon with it through strategic litigation can also be a powerful democratic and anti-corruption tool.
Yes. Okay. With the recent actions of governments that have been deemed excessive, there is also a resurgence in the discussion on how we elect and select our public officials. For me personally, because there are people who blame the voters for the quality of public officials elected into office. But for me personally, it's not necessarily the fault of the people. So I just wanted to flip that narrative in terms of asking, how do we better test and present the competence and probity, or maybe the lack thereof, of people contesting elections? Because these are people who forward themselves, who file candidacies and present themselves to the public that they can serve the people when they're elected in government. So I think there should be better scrutiny in terms of how they would actually perform if they're elected into office. But then how do we do that? In terms of just instead of just blaming the voters, but you know, how do we better come up with information about these candidates that would really test their competence and probity?
Yeah, I believe that you know, like if we only focus on the candidate itself, like the problem won't be solved because the candidate is the is the result of what we called like political party roles in democracy, like how they educate their member to be able to lead the country in executive branch or like legislative branch. So we need to put focus on political party in Indonesian
Mhm.
context, like
Mhm.
how they're really put the anti-corruption commission to their member, and how do
Mhm.
they have how they will be able to to run the country with their ability, with their expertise and such. But also, like, if we also consider state capture, like
Mhm.
in this Indonesian context, the political party itself already captured by the elite, especially the wealthy elite.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we also need to put that context in these matters. Like, the political party itself is not really functioning because it 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 was formed as a, let's say, it's more like a company, like
Yes.
there's an oligarch who
Mhm.
form a political party, but it's more like to serve their interests, not the
Yes.
public interest. So, like, the oligarch lead the political party like a CEO of the
Mhm.
company, and it's a problem. So we need a political party reform in Indonesia, and
Yes.
the political party, like alternative political party, which the
Uh-huh.
party is established as a, like, to serve the public, not the
Mm.
certain interest. What I mean certain interest is like, dirty interest for the
Yes.
elite, oligarch, or some other elites, and yeah. So I don't think people deserve the blame.
Yes.
If they
Mm.
choose someone, they choose someone in the election, because
Mm.
they always be over, like, limited option in terms of
Yes.
election. People
Mm.
doesn't really have a choice. Like, if we choose number two or number one or number three, and number
Mhm.
three wins,
Mhm.
and people like blaming each other. Oh, why did you choose number three? Look at
Yeah.
look at what your decision has resulted in our democracy. I don't think that
Mhm.
kind of views deserve to be continued, because the blame is on the elite and
Mhm.
the political party. Yeah.
Political party reforms. No, I can somehow relate to this because again, just relating on the context of the Philippines. There has been criticism that the political parties in the Philippines do not necessarily have an idea that they uphold, but more of like a social group running for elections. That has been a criticism, and I think it's quite similar to your case in Indonesia, and that's also a very interesting perspective, no, to have more reforms in the political party system of the country. That's interesting. How about you, Sankita?
Yeah, I think generally ensuring citizens are informed about who they're voting for still remains important, but blaming citizens alone gets really difficult because what are the alternatives that you have in making
Mm,
your choices? But I also think it's really important to have long term systemic reform
yes.
um, movements because in Sri Lanka, a little bit along the lines of political party reform, there is another
Mm,
issue that, like, there are these threshold issues that make it really difficult for new political parties to register. So
mm,
there was a real challenge for some of the people who, the youth and other groups that agitated during the Aragale movement, for them
mm,
to be registered in time for the elections,
mm,
right? And that posed a real challenge. So making sure that kind of systemic issue is got rid of in so that we can have democratic processes functioning optimally in
mm,
these windows of opportunity, I think still remains a really important factor so that the issue of lack of alternatives um, can be solved in the shorter term rather than waiting for it to take place over time.
mm,
The other thing is the in the context of lack of alternatives, sometimes civil society and activists get asked, so, but what are you doing about it? Why are you not running for
mm,
office? We have really
mm,
bad politicians because no one's running for office. And even citizens get asked the same question. But
mm,
citizens often don't have the privilege, the power, the wherewithal, the access to finances, women, especially new entrants to politics, other underrepresented groups to
mm,
just up and run for elections. It's not often a fair burden that we place on citizens just like that. And for civil society, I found in Sri Lanka when the 2015 Yahapale government came into play, even with the current reform momentum, with the elections, civil society being asked to run for elections or join government in expert positions or in certain authorities, that has a very kind of difficult effect on civil society, on having that alternative third voice in a functioning democracy, because suddenly you are co-opted into the system. You become tainted with politics or public office. That is one problem for your own legitimacy going forward when parties change, governments change, but also in that process you have deactivated this powerful third voice that could act as a check on even current action, and the importance of which I have been highlighting all along today. So this idea of co-option is something we have to really seriously think about and carefully think about as civil society considers how best to offer their support for reform moments as well.
Okay. I'm aware of time, so I'm down to my last question. We've seen this time and again that the people's interest and engagement in action seeking accountability eventually wane down, either because there are new issues emerging or just because there aren't really much the problems don't really progress, or the resolution to the problems don't really progress that quickly as they would expect. But I would like to ask as my final question, how do we encourage sustainable public engagement and participation in matters of public interest, particularly about public policy making and governance?
Yeah, I believe the consistency matters. In this context, like it can, if there's something happen, we react, respond, and it can be easily. So we need some things to do to
Yes.
prevent that to happen again in the future. But the first thing I would like to say is we need to give like people like access to information, like strengthen their capabilities, their competency, and it could be digital civic platform for policy monitoring. We can provide platform to monitor, for example, what the public official have been doing, or what they're doing, their track record, and etc. Or also in terms of tender, we can establish a platform for public to monitor the tender. We can give them like the information, how the tender is being implemented by the government, how much money they are spending in the procurement, for example, and some other things. Like digital platform matters in this context, of course.
Yes.
And also like we have to provide civic education to increase public awareness, to make them understand again how to monitor corruption in certain sectors. And it will be public budgeting, like conflict of interest monitoring, for example, because
Yes.
conflict of interest may cause corruption, and so on. So also like it could be like offline training, for example, or offline attempts, not only in digital space we do that. And the last one I think is to ensure the protection of the civic space, so people can protest, organize, and participate without any fear. And this is important because if we look at civic risk monitor, like civic space condition in Indonesia and Asia in general are declining. And
Yes.
without protecting civic space, I believe that like the citizen, we wouldn't be able to monitor corruption like like we expecting. And in resource corruption will become rampant. I think, yeah, that's all from me.
Yep. Uh, Sankhita.
Yeah. So what's interesting in the region is that we are finding interest and engagement between elections right now, right? Which is why we're having governments being toppled between elections. So that already is, I think, we can take some hope in that citizens are remaining vigilant between electoral cycles, which is what we keep pushing for, right? But of course, interest can still wane. And that's where I think, in addition to everything that was just said, this is where it becomes really important to have communities of practice that keep following particular interest issues. So, what we've found as civil society is when it comes to these reform moments, you're not given a lot of lead time to suddenly gain expertise on a particular area, whether it's procurement or whether it's asset declarations, beneficial ownership, proceeds of crime. You having put in the work early on
Yes.
really makes a huge difference, especially in these windows of opportunity. And the other thing is it often comes down to these very few people who are quote unquote nerds in a certain area. It's left to them in a country to basically carry the burden of being the civic monitors, the civil society monitors of a particular process in those crucial moments and when it comes to reform. So I just want to highlight the importance of, therefore, sustaining strong, dedicated, watchful civil society and communities of practice in the downtime between these windows of opportunity as well, so
Yes.
that that capacity building and all can be benefited from when those opportunities arise, and then also for them to kind of keep on keeping on even when you
Yes.
don't see these opportunities.
Yeah, no, no, that's all. That's very interesting, no. Um, so I think it's the first time that I've heard of the term communities of practice, but that's actually also, as I would agree, very beneficial because, for example, just requesting statements of assets and liabilities of government officials would be very tedious. And if there are organizations dedicated to monitoring assets and liabilities of elected government officials, eventually they can use what they have found throughout time to look into how government officials have acquired wealth over time. That's interesting, no? And that also shows, I guess, the power of civil society organizations and the value of the work of civil society organizations in any democracy. So, I guess that was my last question. But thank you, Sankita and Egi, for the very insightful afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate all the insights that you've shared with us. I would have to remove you from the feed for me to formally close the show. But again, from ANFREL, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you. Yes, that has been the Election Observer podcast on the power of the electorate beyond the ballot box to demand accountability against erring elected public officials and drive change through collective action. And also the importance of civil society organizations, no, in any democracy. And that has also been the Election Observer podcast season 2. This is actually our last episode for this season. I have supposedly a clap applause. Get the latest news and updates about ANFREL programs and activities through our Facebook, X, LinkedIn, and TikTok pages. You can also subscribe to our YouTube and WhatsApp channels. Please follow the Election Observer podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you for joining us again today. Thank you for joining us in this season 2 of the Election Observer podcast. We'll see you in season 3 of the Election Observer Podcast. I'm your host, John Antiquera. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.